Hello, everyone. I'm Abebe Selassie, Director of the IMF's African Department, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to Africa Perspectives. During these events, we discuss Africa's pressing economic policy issues, and today we have the great honor of hosting our distinguished guest, Ken Opalo, professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Sub-Saharan Africa is facing a confluence of deep challenges, including the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic, spillovers from the war in Ukraine, food insecurity, and climate change, to name a few. Macroeconomic imbalances in the context of a big funding squeeze are back with a vengeance in some countries. These challenges necessitate agile policy responses, often requiring difficult choices and trade-offs. These reforms, of course, are, as always, country-specific and deeply political in nature. So understanding the political economy of reforms can help design, adopt, and implement successful policy changes. Today, we're going to discuss these issues and more with our guest, Professor Ken Opalo, a prominent academic scholar and writer who has made significant contributions towards enhancing our understanding of the African political economy. He has his PhD in political science from Stanford University and has spent 20 years studying these issues and thinking deeply about them. His widely read blog, An Africanist Perspective, draws important insights into a wide range of topics related to the African context. Welcome, Ken. It really is great to have you here with us. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So to start our discussion, this term reform often implies the need for change to improve policies or institutions because current arrangements are inadequate to what's needed. You've written a recent blog post, basically advising practitioners to always avoid, to stop always going for the first best policies and accept that trade-offs are sometimes unavoidable. Well, can you give us a little bit about the dynamic of political economy reforms as you see it in the region? I know it's difficult to generalize. Maybe you want to pick a country or two. And what you see as the barriers to implementing reforms and how they can be overcome.
So that's a great and big question. I think the big background condition that we should always have in mind when we're thinking about reforms in the region is the fact that state capacity in the region remains weak, right? So state capacity then limits the extent to which governments can move nimbly in a reform direction. So that even whenever there's, and sorry to use this term, whenever there's political will, often the mechanisms of change may not be as adequate as needed to move in the right direction. So that's the big background condition. The second major point that we should always have in mind is that over the last 30 years or so, many African countries have adopted competitive politics, whether they're full-fledged democracies or electoral democracies or electoral authoritarian states, right? They have electoral politics, which then means that alliance building and maintaining coalitions that sustain ruling coalitions is front of mind for many policymakers. So the confluence of these two factors mean that reform is not always easy, and unfortunately, as you noted at the beginning of your question, most of the time when we suggest reforms, we often fail to take seriously these two constraints, right? That states may not have the mechanisms to reform as quickly or as well as we would want them to, and two, that elites in power face real constraints that we should not just wish away, and that those constraints are actually a feature, not a bug of the system. If we really care about institutions and strong institutions at that, if we want political accountability, right, that will mean that we have to go through the messy process of taking politics into account when we think about reform processes.
Great starting answer, I guess. So to drill down on this issue a little bit, I guess the issue on politics needing to form coalition to gain power is something that's universal around the world. But perhaps what distinguishes our region is the weak institutional capacity, yeah? That you highlighted. Can I ask, what do you see as the key factors that have limited state capacity in the region? Is it simply the general low level of education? Is it low level of resource mobilization? What do you see as the key constraint on state capacity?
I mean, I think, and you know, this may sound like a cop-out answer, but I think one of the biggest reasons is just history, right? Many states in the region are fairly young, right? 60 years as of today in most places. You know, in the long historical sort of time span that we should be thinking about, these are still fairly young states, and in some ways it's remarkable that they still function the way they do given their age. But I think when it comes specifically to policymaking, I think one of the contributors to the challenges today is the sort of 20-year gap that we had beginning in the early 80s through the year 2000, in which I think policymakers went out of practice because the crisis forced them to step back in many ways and not, you know, cultivate the same skill sets that we saw in the early post-colonial period. So if you look at most African states in the 60s and 70s, they're very ambitious. They're trying big things with very meager resources, and in many ways achieving remarkable results, right? Tanzania achieves universal primary education by the late 70s, such that, you know, I would say it's the fact that many of them, because of the economic and political crisis of the 80s and 90s, went out of practice, that now they're only beginning to rebuild the capacity to make good policy and implement good policy, and get personnel who, you know, mission-driven enough to want to do the same things that policymakers did in the heydays of good policymaking in the region in the 70s.
Thank you. So I think that's a good take, and what I have a lot of sympathy for. So coming back to the question of reforms, they often, of course, they can be unpopular, right? The benefits often accrue over time, and probably, I mean, if you're doing the right type of reforms, tend to be more generalized, while the beneficiaries of current arrangements, institutional reforms, tend to be concentrated and sometimes politically powerful. So what we call vested interests, they can block those reforms. How do you begin the process of thinking about making the case for, I don't know, reform like, you know, moving away from generalized fuel subsidies in a place like Nigeria, or you could pick any example. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we should do is to map out the interests, as you point out, right? Because, you know, as I like to remind my students, you know, saying that there wasn't political will is not a good answer to why policies fail, right? When we design policies, we should account for, you know, pivotal actors who may kill or help specific interventions succeed. So knowing who are the vested interests, who are pro-status quo, and then, you know, building coalitions that do not make them feel like they're absolute losers in the process of change. So if you're thinking about fuel subsidies in Nigeria now, right, there's a whole political economy around the fuel subsidies. People who sell generators, the importers of fuel, right? They have to be taken into account, and often, you know, they're a lot bigger of a hindrance to policy change than even the general public that would have to pay higher fuel prices. So the backroom negotiations, honest negotiations at that would need to take place, I feel like haven't taken place, because often, you know, the prescriptions come with an understanding that, you know, the current behaviors of the said vested interests are suboptimal, and therefore we should just ignore them and focus on the politicians and the general public. But if we took the coalitions around the politicians, many of whom benefit from the status quo, seriously, then, you know, we can begin the elite level frank discussions that are needed to you know, come up with change processes that are not perfect, but begin the journey in the right direction. And that would also mean accepting, you know, second, third best solutions to start with.
These, of course, are, as I hinted at the outset, deeply domestic and, as you highlight, also deeply political issues. Who do we look to initiate these changes? Is it legislatures? Is it, the executive arm of the state? Who typically would we expect to see changes, and who has more traction?
I should admit that I have a bias in favor of legislatures, right? I think we should start with legislatures in the sense that, even in a country like Nigeria or Kenya, even Uganda, right? Parliaments may be weak in terms of the ability to check the executive all the time, but they still remain important arenas for building political coalitions. And so if you get Parliament on board for in support of a specific change, right, it begins to create a public discourse that may influence the behavior of elites in power, the executive branch, or the vested interests around those elites in power. So I'd begin by, understanding what are the formal institutional mechanisms for change, and make sure that the discussion is being had within those formal mechanisms. And then second, also have a direct, frank conversation with the executive branch, taking their interests into account. Their interests here being, their desire to protect potential losers, and also their electoral interests, which is re-election for their coalition.
How do you see the balance between legislatures and the executive arm in the region having evolved over time? Because, initially not initially, in the initial wave of kind of elections that we saw in the region starting in the early 90s, there was a little bit of a sense that legislatures remain a bit of a rubber stamp. I know it varies from country to country quite a bit. But how do you see the health of legislatures, as it were, and their ability to counterbalance the executive in our region?
Yeah, I think things have improved, right? Electoral politics always means that legislatures, even though as institutions they take time to evolve, right? But the fact that they are elected and that their resolutions are formally binding, at least symbolically binding, executives pay close attention to them. So in my own research, what I've seen is that just the mere fact of having a process, right, creates a time lag between decisions and actual implementation. And that time lag may introduce new information that actually changes policy. So if you look at data from Kenya from, say, 92 to 2002, even though the same autocratic president was still in power, the fact that you had a competitively elected legislature meant that the share of his bills that got passed in parliament actually went down, right? On account purely of just the process, right? If you go through the process, people learn to appreciate the process, coalitions build around specific issues, and habits form about, the role of the legislature. So I think even though, in the headline figures, right, if you look at the legislature in Uganda vis-a-vis President Museveni, it may not appear like they constrain him, but in practice, right, he has to engage in a lot more persuasion to get anything done. That, in my view, is an improvement on the previous state of affairs.
Definitely an improvement, absolutely. I would strongly agree. Just because you touched on your home country, Kenya, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. First is, what do you make of the elections last year? There was quite a bit of excitement that a new form of electoral politics, a new form of coalition building in Kenya has perhaps been found, or perhaps around economic policy interests, class issues, rather than the way things had been a little bit more along regional lines in the past. I would love to hear your take on that, and then maybe we can switch to a couple other countries in the region.
Yeah. Yes, I think most of us were excited about the prospect of a movement away from the ethnic census elections that we've had in the past. I wouldn't say that it was a purely class-driven election, but I think the biggest shift that we saw was that the discussion of economic policies was front and center, which I think was a big improvement, and which we've seen over the last 6 months generated, metrics for holding the current government accountable. Because their campaign promise was based on economic issues, and voters and the media keep looking at those specific economic promises as a means of holding them to account. Which, in a way, right? I know it's still early days, but it's encouraging to see that, the cynics might have argued that, well, that was the campaigns. They'll govern in prose, as the saying goes. But I think the narrative and economic narratives in particular that they campaigned on becoming a constraint or a system of accountability that's forcing them to remain attentive to the specific economic issues that they promised to address.
Is this a Kenya-specific issue or something that you've seen across the region? I'm thinking here a little bit, at least in Eastern Southern Africa, or Malawi, perhaps Zambia. We've seen elements of this in recent elections. Or
yeah, I think Zambia would probably be the best example of this, right? And Zambia actually precedes Kenya, because I think Zambia made the corner in the 2011 election, which was the PF won on the back of urban discontent. And so I think it's a general trend in urbanizing African countries where the old model of ethnic-driven mobilization of the rural areas and complete drowning out of the urban electorate, which at times did not vote along ethnic lines, right, is on the wane. Because in urban areas, people are looking for jobs, governments that can provide healthcare, education, lower the cost of living. Those issues are blind to ethnicity. And so the sort of economic discourse will continue to dominate elections in countries that are moving in that direction.
So, one thing I've been thinking about is, of course, we only have a few data points, but this is a little bit at odds to what we see elsewhere, in some of the advanced countries, for example, where politics has gone a little bit more along nationalistic lines rather than economic lines, which we're talking about here. Is this indeed our region kind of, showing a different path forward, or we're lagging behind? I'm not entirely clear.
Yeah, I think because of the needs are different, right? And so the politics will necessarily be different. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, right? Of course, there's still there's opportunities for backlash. Even in Nigeria, right? We're seeing it with for example, the governor election in Lagos. A reminder that ethnic mobilization is still a thing. Even though the economic message is also emerging as a relevant factor in elections. So I would argue that, yes, there is a possibility of continued mobilization along ethnic line or nationalistic lines. But the structural reality of urbanization, less reliance on agriculture, will not be easy to just wish away, even by the most ardent of ethnic entrepreneurs, right? That will just remain this. It's a growing structural reality in the region that will continue to shape politics moving forward.
Okay. Great points. So, if I may, I want to switch a little bit more to public finance. We are seeing, of course, governments right now being challenged like they haven't in a generation, in having to deal with a legacy of stock of debt issue. And also facing quite a difficult time mobilizing revenues, and yet remaining under pressure to continue to spend. These are issues on which you've written quite a bit, so I wanted to ask a couple of questions in this area. Again, it's very difficult to generalize, and there's a lot of nuance, of course, but from your perspective, what do you see as the key drivers in bringing countries to the situation that they are? Of course, exogenous factors have played a role, but do you see the reason why debt levels have gone up and we're now facing larger deficits being primarily excessive spending? Is it an inability, perhaps related to the state capacity issue, to raise more revenues? Or just appetites are just too big? The governments have to deliver on all the political pressures that they have to face, so they need to run large deficits.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say three things that contribute to how we got here with the current debt crisis of sorts. One is that, as you said, right, the region has immense demands, right? The infrastructure gap in the region is, more than $100 billion each year. Countries simply cannot save their way to building the infrastructure they need. So borrowing has to be on the table. Investments in education, right? Free primary education, free secondary education is now a big thing. Universal healthcare, right, is a big thing. So those investments, again, fueled by increasing electoral competition, also put pressure on governments to spend more, right? Spending more meant borrowing. And then I think because many of the countries, right, they're part of the highly indebted poor countries, debt forgiveness processes of the late 90s, also had a bit of fiscal room, which enabled them to borrow more. And so I think the confluence of those three factors, right, has meant that some governments have found themselves squeezed quite a bit. Whereby some of the gambles that they took in investing in infrastructure did not pay off. Some of it because of poor policy making, right? Projects that were not well thought out, that were not fully intended to be commercially viable, that were perhaps designed for nefarious reasons. But I think some of it also just because of bad luck, right? They made bets that did not pay off, and I think often we're too harsh on low-income countries when their bets don't pay off, forgetting that policymakers have to make some bets on big transformational projects, and sometimes those bets don't pay off, and we shouldn't learn the wrong lessons from bets that don't pay off.
If I may, I wanted to drill down into each one of these factors that you highlighted. I mean, something that you write quite a bit about is, this last issue. There's an element of project selection, I guess, maybe not always perhaps selecting the projects with the highest rates of returns. But ex ante, of course, it's difficult to know which projects. That's the point that you're making. But another aspect of it, of course, is that there are governance issues around some of these projects. What do you think is the balance between these two factors in say, kind of, contributing to spending being not as efficient as it could be?
I think,
and again, I completely agree
Yeah.
with you that, efficiency of spending issues are universal,
Yeah.
not unique to our countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'd begin by saying that, right, when you're poor, right, your margin of error is very slim. I'm reminded that the biggest corruption scandal ever in Malawi was something to the tune of $30 million, right? In a typical American city, that's a rounding error in corruption, right? But because you're Malawi, that's a big deal that sinks President Banda. But that said, right, I think it'd be hard for me to say on balance because I see it as a mix in different stages of the project sort of evolution, right? Easy accessibility of loans means that, projects don't go through the requisite scrutiny that they need for us to figure out, what projects are viable or not. The opaqueness of the processes often mean, again, that, we don't know where the money is going. And then, there's also just good faith lack of capacity to do what's needed to efficiently implement projects. So, I think net, I would argue that the sort of governance issues, right, tend to be overblown when we think about projects. That this is not to say that it's not important to address those governance issues, but I think I would address those governance issues by focusing more on capacity, right? So that capacity begins to challenge the governance gaps that we see, right? If the technical team at the transportation ministry in a typical African country can, go head to head with the technical team, say at a Chinese construction company or bank lending to an African government, then you can begin to have a conversation that, yes, the conversations may account for the governance sort of wastage that's needed to get projects going. But at that point, we're talking about, corruption that greases the wheels versus, sand in the cogs types of corruption. I would take that world any day, as opposed to the current state of affairs.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Drilling into, I guess, the revenue side of the challenge that our countries face. In many countries, as you know, the challenge, of course, has been that even where projects have been implemented really well, and I think that's, on balance, the vast majority of cases, governments have not been as good at capturing the rate of return on these projects through the tax system. Some of it could be due to popularity. I mean, let me ask you, why do you see that is? And second, what can be done to address this?
Yeah, so on revenue, right, it's a chicken and egg problem. If the government doesn't do well, you don't have sufficient tax morale for people to pay their taxes. And therefore, the government doesn't do well, and therefore tax morale stays diminished. I think solving that sort of fiscal pact question would be key to resolving the revenue issue. Even before we think about, tax mobilization capacities at, revenue authorities across the region. And so, I think if governments did a better job of demonstrating good use of taxes, I think there would be more appetite for, tax paying and tax mobilization in the region. Now, most countries are doing better than we would expect, given their capacities and given, the small size of the formal sectors of the economies. But I think overall, it's a problem of governments either not sufficiently convincing the public that their taxes will be used well, or governments intentionally not taxing everyone because they don't want the scrutiny that comes with, broad-based taxation. And I think especially this latter point tends to be ignored, right? We tend to assume that governments always want to tax everyone everywhere. But, most of rural Africa is not taxed. Part of the reason is political, right? The government knows that if you start taxing rural people, they'll want something in return. And if you don't have the capacity to deliver, or if you're not sure you can deliver, or you want to win the next election, then, that's not a fight you want to pick up.
But is this sustainable? Is this durable, given the big challenge that countries are facing? And how do we make the leap towards, broadening the social contract, or strengthening the social contract in countries? I have in mind many countries, but also Kenya comes to mind.
Yeah, it's definitely not sustainable. I think one way around this problem would be a process that I've seen in, say, Kenya and Ghana as good examples of this that I've looked at closely. The fiscal space to be able to borrow meant that governments actually did very big things with borrowed funds, which then created demand for similarly big things, which governments then engaged in. Both Kenya and Ghana to a large extent facing a squeeze right now. But I think moving forward, right, voters will not forget that governments can actually do big things in these two countries. And so that demand for big things, right, will create sort of the beginnings of this fiscal pact that, there's a credible demonstrated capacity to actually be able to do big things, which means that governments, because they borrowed in the past, will be forced to tax more to service the debts and create more fiscal space. But in the process, also demonstrate to their voters that, oh, yeah, we can actually, build roads, have free secondary education and the like, which voters desperately need right now.
You contrasted Kenya and Ghana. Can I ask you one more question on exactly this public finance issue, which is, to what extent do you see any commonalities or differences in electoral politics having driven the size of fiscal deficits? I mean, sorry, fiscal deficits tend to swing into big, numbers in Ghana during electoral periods, not as much in Kenya. So I should be direct with my question, I guess. And so, what aspect of the political economy in these two countries do you see as being responsible for this? Is it the fact that elections are very, very finely won with thin margins in Ghana, or some other factor at play?
I mean, I'd probably tie this to, at least more recently, to Ghana's oil, the false promise of oil revenue. I think Ghanaian politicians thought they could get away with a lot because of both gold exports, but also because of oil, at least since 2009. I think that sort of made them not as aware of the dangers ahead as perhaps they should have been. And I would also argue that I think Ghana's strong party system has meant that, even though parties may have small majorities, but intra-party discipline has often insulated the executive from accountability mechanisms, which again facilitates sort of less attention to the dangers ahead. Kenya has pretty fractious politics, which means that it's hard to implement big policies without noise. So the noise sort of slows things down, and combine that with the fact that Kenya does not have a resource base to rely on. That has put sort of a cap on spending in many ways.
One of the things I've been struck by is, how gloomy, at least outside, sitting in Washington, or as we both do, but also elsewhere, really, outside the region, how gloomy the perception is about the region. When I'm in the region, however, I mean, I'm struck by the optimism, by the resilience, private sector in particular. How do you explain this? I mean, first, do you agree with this take? I mean, you're coming, I know, just from Nairobi very recently. And second, how do you explain it if it's something that you also perceive?
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with you in the sense that, right, most people want to have a better future, right, and that's reflected in how they cope with the current crisis. And the discourse is often one of how do we get out of this crisis. I think outside the region, right, the horrors of the 80s still loom large in people's minds, right? And you see it both in academic writing and in the media, right? There's always this fear that African countries will revert back to the bad old days, that long disastrous decade in 1980 to around 95. And so the fear that things will go back to being as bad as they used to be, I think makes people quick to run to doom and gloom when they think about the region, right? So, if you read about the Ghanaian crisis, yes, it's a serious situation that needs quite a bit of reckoning at the political level. But, Ghana is not going to go back to the Ghana of the 80s, right? This time will be different for a whole host of reasons. And so, I'd say that, the policy response at this point shouldn't be to give up. It should be to realize the gains that have been made and do everything possible to protect those gains in preparation for the next big leap after these countries weather the current storm.
Your optimism is one I share also. And, to your what do you base this optimism on? When you say Ghana, or other countries facing difficult macroeconomic challenges right now will be moving to another level, is it because you see the level of technological adoption or human capital formation having reached a critical mass? Why can't the next generation or the next few governments not make the same policy mistakes that
of the past? You mean? I mean, I think one, we're not going to make the policy mistake of the 80s of blaming government for everything that went wrong, right? I think there's a little bit more sort of open-mindedness about the role of government in the process of economic development, which means that even as we push for fiscal consolidation, we're not going to cut to the bone and weaken the very states that need strengthening at this critical time. I think African countries are also a little bit more diversified than they were in the 80s, which will create some room for slack, which then will allow for resiliency, as you put it, as they weather the current storm. I think it also helps that globally, right, the sort of global best practices are not just coming from one place, Washington, D.C., right? There are multiple points and alternative views around the world, and many potential friends that will help different countries weather the storm in different ways. So that, we'll see a lot of policy experimentation. Just over the weekend, Kenya announced this policy experimentation to reduce dollar demand by getting fuel imports on credit from Middle Eastern countries, right? It's not clear whether this will work or not, but it's a nice experiment that is possible now because there are alternative ways of doing things, right? And just, going back to the age thing, right? In 1980, African countries were 20 years old, and they were hit by, a wrecking ball of a global economic crisis. It shouldn't surprise us that many of them did not do well, right? They're still trying to figure themselves out. 60 years out, many of them, strong enough now to figure themselves out and to find ways through the current crisis. So that's, those are the basis of my optimism.
Thank you. Very good to know that it's we're not isolated here at the fund in thinking that the future remains very, very bright and needs to be supported. So wanted to drill into a couple of sectors. Maybe start with education. I know this is something that you've written quite a bit about. As much progress have been made, and I think really staggering when just how much education outcomes have improved in the region overall. There still remains, a huge challenge in many parts of the country, particularly in the provision of basic education, basic literacy. Last summer I was in Niamey, and I had a visit to these things called école payotes, like bamboo schools, literally made out of bamboo sticks, in which much education takes place. And of course, I was in Lusaka with our managing director a few weeks ago, and the push for universal secondary education there has led to overcrowding of classes. Mm-hmm. So there are these worrisome pockets. I know this is something that you've thought quite a bit about, and how do you see the progress in this area? I know there are pockets like Tanzania where there is decent progress, but elsewhere, the challenge remains really profound. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think education is one of those big policy questions that impacts every household, and so it's front and center on politicians' minds. And so the way I see education right now is the universal primary education push, which was part of the Millennium Development Goals, was a noble effort. Unfortunately, for some reason, policymakers did not think that if you get kids through primary school, there's going to be demand for secondary schools and universities. So the current political question on education is free secondary education, right? It's in Ghana, it's in Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Tanzania. which is leading to overcrowding in high schools as much as we saw in the early 2000s with primary schools. There's also the question of higher education and the funding of higher education. And then globally, right, the focus is on learning outcomes as opposed to sort of increasing access in a sustainable manner, right? And these things then create tension within governments and their policymaking processes. How do you cater to the global push to improve learning outcomes at all costs, right? So, you have global policy experts who will say that, the bamboo schools in Niamey are enough to produce good learning outcomes, right? And they don't want to listen to the fact that politicians want to build, concrete schools because they want to show that, they're modernizing the education system. And so I think in overall, right, I would say that human capital development has improved. More people are going through schools. That some of the good schools on the continent are doing well. We see that in African students who then go overseas and do very well at top universities across the world. At the same time, though, there's a risk that increasing access without paying close attention to quality will lead to too much dilution. And I think there's a bit of a mismatch between what politicians want and what sort of global education experts want. And I keep highlighting global experts because, they tend to have quite a bit of influence on governments in terms of what governments prioritize, right? It would have been great if African governments would move at their own pace in expanding access, investing in schools, designing their own curriculums that pay attention to social and political context, so that education becomes what it is everywhere, which is a social thing. Yeah.
Very interesting. So you mentioned the influence of international experts. I mean, what is the lesson that international experts have to learn? What is it that we could do better to try and internalize the, deeply local, deeply domestic nature of processes like this?
Yeah, I think it's that education is not just about test scores and producing human capital, right? It's deeply embedded in social struggles and conflicts, right? And that to have a good education system that actually produces good learning outcomes and high quality human capital, you need to pay attention to the other functions of education that society wants, right? Political sort of indoctrination or education, civics education, social formation, and all these things. So I would say, being a bit more humble and leaning a lot more on domestic voices rather than top-down sort of templates for reform would be the way to go. Going back to sort of the reform point, right? I think if I could pick one sector that's been worst affected by reformitis, it's education in the region. Just too many reforms and programs all the time without really much to show for it.
And these reforms are not as helpful because they're distracting from local objectives, or there's too many ideas that are being pursued rather than basic arithmetic, basic learning and writing skills. I mean, what is it that these reforms are doing?
Yeah, I think it's too many ideas without opportunity for them to settle, right, and become part of the woodwork.
Churn.
Yeah. So lots of new ideas come in, with every new sort of idea of how to improve learning outcomes, you may have whole systems upended. And that is problematic in the long run because there's a lot of movement but not much progress.
I mean, so what is it that makes education susceptible to this relative to other areas? Or is it your perception that all the other areas are also susceptible to this same problem? And what is it that governments can do to minimize this?
Yeah, I mean, I think education is a bit more susceptible because the stakeholders in education, right? There's this sort of weird match between parents demanding high quality education now and government's desire to signal that they're doing something about it, right? So because it impacts every household, and government's desire to signal that they're doing something about it means that they'll always try something new. In most countries, right, education is the biggest expenditure item on government budgets. And so there's a need to signal that, oh, we're doing something about this problem. And often, doing something means doing something new as opposed to strengthening what exists to make it better.
One of the things that I've been struck by on education is just how much people are willing to pay for better quality education out of pocket. The model we have in the region, however, now is the government paying for everything and kind of ignoring or looking askance at the private education sector. Are we missing a trick here? Are we missing, a way in which there can be perhaps, both private and public could be providing better education services jointly in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on here that the model should be a mixed model, and I think Kenya to some extent demonstrated this in the 60s, 80s, where the government had pretty high-performing public schools, which in many ways are still the best schools in the country. There's a vibrant private sector, and then a lower-tier public education system, often overcrowded, often not so well run. But this tiered system meant that a lot of what used to be district and provincial schools in Kenya in the 80s and 90s have actually over the years improved so much that they now compete with the national schools. And it may not be politically palatable or sound good for experts in the sector to imagine deliberate tiered system, but one of the usefulness of a system where there are multiple options is that you can learn from the multiple options on how to be a good school in a context like Kenya, instead of always imagining that you can change the whole system at once. This sort of gradual system, perhaps for political reasons, you could do again what Kenya did, which is have a quota system so that the best schools get kids from all over the country as a way of buying political support for the tiered system. I think that would be, a practical way to approach the problem rather than imagining that you'll have 30,000 great schools all at once.
Thanks. Fascinating. So shifting gears to a little bit more external developments. In one of your recent blog posts, you talked quite a bit about the changing external power structure facing the region, the rise of geopolitical tensions. They've been there for a while, but they're coming into quite an acute relief in parts now, right? And what implications this may have for countries. Now, earlier you said you painted a fairly benign picture that the region can remain non-aligned and exploit this period of heightened fragmentation. But isn't there also a risk, though, that we revert back to the dreaded 1980s when countries were pushed into aligning themselves with one group, part or another, and the effect of that was to coddle them rather than pursue what's in the best interest of their people. I mean, by relying on one power or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk that you highlight is real, right? But I think what's different now is that the demand from below is fairly strong, a lot stronger than it was in the 80s, right? So the mix of global competition and domestic electoral demands, and I can't stress this enough, this is true in both electoral democracies, but also in the electoral authoritarian states, right, will mean that how elites engage with the global powers will be, with one eye on global geopolitics and another eye on domestic politics, right? So to the extent that countries are facing these two elites are facing these two pressures, I think this time will be a little bit different. And if you look at, say, Zambia and Kenya as good examples, right? On the electoral democracy front, they've been very open to Western suggestions and recommendations for electoral democratic reforms. Those reforms have created enormous demand on ruling elites who've looked to China to get loans to meet the electoral demands, right? So, I think this is a dynamic that is playing out in the region, such that, if you're sitting at the State Department here in D.C. and wanting countries to be democratic, right? If you succeed at your efforts but don't avail financing for projects and other things that elections will create demands for, guess what? They'll go looking for where that money is easily available. And right now, borrowing in China is a good and quick way for governments to get projects done within electoral business cycles. They don't have to wait for a 6-year feasibility study by the World Bank, not to malign your sister institution here, right? They can get railways built on time ahead of the next election by getting loans from China.
And the electoral autocracies, I think it is, you put them? I mean, how do you see this helping, impacting those countries?
Yeah, I think it's the same, right? It's sort of the same that, they...
Well, they have less expectation to deliver on at the time of elections, no?
No, they do.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're like, full-on autocracies that perhaps are a little bit more insulated. But, if you look at the more competitive systems, I'll pick Uganda, right? President Museveni has never really faced a challenge to his rule, but even he has faced enormous pressure to show that he's performing and delivering, right? So, he's not that insulated from that electoral imperative that I think many countries are facing. Doing visible and attributable things is sort of, it's a big thing and everyone expects you to do it, so most leaders feel the pressure to do it.
Thanks. Last question, Ken, and perhaps the most important one. I often feel that the unfolding demographic story in Africa, as we speak, is one of the most overlooked stories in global economics, global politics, in terms of how it's going to shape the future of our world over the next 30, 40, 50 years, from many angles. One, I mean, this is where the future global labor force is coming into being, in terms of the incremental effects on things like climate change, etc. This is the region that's going to have the most impact. I mean, yes, maybe that China and India are the biggest polluters, and of course the industrialized countries. But going forward, both in terms of the effects of climate change, but also marginal contribution to global warming, unless we adopt the right technologies, that's where it's going to all happen. But this tends to be overlooked. I would love to hear your take on, one, if you agree if these demographic issues that are ongoing in the region are important and on a global scale, and then second, what it is that we can do to bring more attention to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on, right? I wrote a post titled 3 billion Africans, right? In our lifetime, if we get to live long enough, right, we'll live in a world where there are 3 billion Africans. What does that mean? It means a lot more people in urban areas demanding jobs and better government performance, a lot more African immigrants outside of the region, more demand on governments to do more, and also potential to shape global geopolitics, right? And Nigeria with 400 million people, or Ethiopia with 150 million people looks very different than the countries that we see today. So I think this is a big story that more people should be paying attention to. And I think the challenge moving forward, right, is can African countries develop quickly enough to make sure that in the coming years, right, we don't just have 3 billion stomachs, but we have 3 million well-trained people and brains to power the next phase of African development. I think that's the tension that I think about when I think about the demographic trends in the region. Will there be sufficient investment in the human capital so that we get 3 billion brains, or are we going to just have 3 million stomachs to take care of, right? Governments should think seriously about these twin challenges. If we go the stomachs route, right, there'll be a lot of crises, food crisis and all that. Now, how do we get more people to pay attention to this? I think, it'll be forced on them, right? Kind of like how now, right, American foreign policy and European foreign policy are quickly adjusting to the geopolitical relevance of the region, having seen what other major and middle powers are able to do in the region. I think anyone who doesn't pay attention now will be shocked, when suddenly there are 3 billion Africans with, 60 million in the diaspora, forcing the issue of the region's importance on the global stage. Not to mention things about climate change, jobs, markets, and all that.
I mean, what's a bit worrisome is that this fierce urgency of needing to invest in the region now, support the region now, given exactly the workforce of the coming years is needing to be educated now, is lacking, is missing. And that's why I was saying kind of the importance of needing to bring attention to this issue. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think any outsider who wants to have friends in the region moving forward, right, should have the foresight to invest in the region's human capital of the future today, so that you lock in the friendliness and ties, right? I mean, I still, even with the looming enormous demand, right, I'm still optimistic that the trends in human capital development are good enough. They're not great, but they're good enough, right? African universities are getting better, and to the extent that they're not able to absorb everyone, there's been an explosion of African students moving out of the region. China now has more students than the US, right? Those engineers will come back to the region to do big things, right? So similarly, Turkey has become a major business partner. Maybe Turkish universities may be able to absorb a lot more African students. So I see there being enough of an opportunity to invest in human capital that's just good enough to keep the region moving, even as it faces this enormous demographic gap. But it would be great if we were a bit more serious and deliberate in cultivating the human capital of the future, knowing, the demographic trends.
Indeed. Ken, I cannot thank you enough for these incredibly insightful views. We usually do this bilaterally, so it's good to be able to share your deep and profound insights with a broader audience. Thank you so much for coming, and look forward to continuing our conversations. I hope to have you back one of these days soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and yeah, keep the optimistic flame alive, please.
Absolutely. It will happen. This is the African century.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today for this discussion. Hope to see you again in one of our future series. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Okay. Ken.